Picture yourself on a hillside somewhere in deep prehistory. The sun has just dropped behind the ridge, the fire has burned down to a low orange pulse, and the day's hunt is finished. There is no schedule waiting for you, no message left unanswered, no low-grade worry about tomorrow's work. There's only the heat on your face, the dark pressing in from every side, and a thin rope of smoke that keeps bending into your eyes because you sat in the wrong place. And at some point, on some night exactly like this one of your ancestors stopped batting that smoke away and leaned into it instead. That small, strange decision is where the story begins. This is not a story about cigarettes, not cigars, not vapes, not the coworker who corners you by the back door for one more drag. It's about the very first time a human being chose to pull burning plant matter into their lungs on purpose, and about a genuinely unsettling possibility. That the urge to do so is far, far older than anything we'd normally call a habit. Because here's what almost nobody tells you. Smoking does not begin with tobacco. It doesn't begin with trade ships or sacred pipes or even farming. The pull towards smoke may be wired into us at a level so deep it sits underneath civilization entirely. And the trail of evidence pointing that way is stranger than you'd ever guess. Before you can smoke anything, you need fire. And fire has been keeping our ancestors company for a staggeringly long time. The oldest solid evidence comes from a place called Wonderwork Cave, a vast dolomite cavern near the edge of the Kalahari in South Africa's northern Cape. Deep inside, archaeologists found microscopic wood ash, scorched plant remains, and charred fragments of bone, none of it carried in by wind, water, or a passing wildfire. This was a contained, deliberate fire, burning inside a sheltered space. For years, the accepted date sat at around 1 million years, but a 2026 reanalysis pushed deeper into the cave's oldest layers and found burnt bone reaching back somewhere between roughly 1.07 and 1.79 million years ago. 1 million plus years ago, the beings huddled around that flame were not us. They were almost certainly Homo erectus, an earlier branch of the family, with a smaller skull, a heavier brow ridge, and not the slightest interest in being told what to do with either. They probably couldn't even make fire on demand. The evidence suggests they did something more modest and more vivid. They caught fire from natural wildfires, carried a burning branch home, and kept it alive until it died. But here's the thing. They sat around that fire just like we do. They cooked. They warmed themselves. They crowded close when the light failed. And every single night, for an unimaginable stretch of nights, anyone near the flames breathed smoke. It was constant. It was unavoidable. It was simply the air they lived in, the original air quality situation, and nobody had an app to check the readings. This is where the ordinary turns interesting. When you burn plant material, you don't just get a tidy puff of warm air and water vapor. You get a chemical cocktail, and exactly what's in it depends entirely on what's burning. Some plants, when they smolder, release compounds that reach straight into the human nervous system and quietly rearrange how a person feels. Which means some of our distant relatives, sitting downwind of the wrong shrub, were almost certainly catching a mild lift off the campfire, with no idea on earth why the evening suddenly felt so good. This isn't a fringe theory cooked up to sound edgy. Researchers have argued for decades that early humans living among forests and grasslands would have been bathed over and over in the smoke of plants that happened to carry mind-altering chemistry. And the human body, it turns out, was strangely ready for the encounter. We carry a built-in network, the endocannabinoid system, with receptors that respond to compounds found in cannabis. That system didn't evolve because of the plant. It runs its own internal business, helping regulate mood, memory, and appetite. But because those receptors are already there, the first time a human inhaled smoke from a burning cannabis plant, their brain didn't recoil in confusion. Some part of it recognized the visitor instantly, as if a door it had been holding shut had finally swung open. That instant of recognition, repeated across countless fires and countless lifetimes, may be the true birth of smoking. Not a decision, Not an invention. Just a very pleasant accident that kept happening until eventually someone connected the feeling to the smoke and thought to make it happen on purpose. Sit with that for a second. The entire multi-trillion-dollar global tobacco industry, the centuries of ritual, the shamanic traditions, the medical practices, the social rituals, all of it may trace back to one exhausted hunter who picked a bad seat and stumbled into the best night of his week. History rests its grandest structures on the most absurd little foundations. Now we have to be careful, because two claims are quietly tangled together, and they are not the same size. Ancient people inhaled smoke from useful plants is one statement. Ancient people deliberately cultivated plants in order to smoke them is a much bigger one. So, what does the dirt actually say? Some of the clearest early evidence of intentional cannabis use, meaning burned cannabis, in a setting that points toward deliberate inhaling, comes from the Jirzhankal Cemetery, high on the Pamir Plateau in what's now Xinjiang in far western China. At nearly 10,000 feet, in a string of tombs dated to around 500 BC, excavators found 10 wooden braziers, each holding stones that had been heated until they glowed. When chemists at the Max Planck Institute analyzed the residue, they found the chemical fingerprint of cannabis, specifically cannabinol, or CBN, the compound left behind when THC oxidizes, and the levels were high. This was not the everyday plant grown for rope and seed. This was a potent strain, possibly favored precisely because cannabis grown at high altitude tends to pack more THC, deliberately burned inside enclosed tombs, where mourners could breathe the smoke. One grave even held an angular harp of the kind used in ancient funerals. So, roughly 2,500 years ago for the smoke. But a question should be nagging at the back of your mind by now. Does the absence of older physical evidence mean it didn't happen earlier? Or just that we haven't found it? Because soft organic things, leaves, seeds, plant fiber, almost never survive thousands of years in the ground. We hold stone tools from over 3 million years ago, because stone is essentially indestructible. A wooden pipe packed with dried herb? Gone within a few centuries under normal conditions. A leather pouch of cannabis dissolves back into the soil long before any archaeologist shows up with a trowel. So in this case, the silence of the record is not a verdict. The absence of evidence is emphatically not evidence of absence. There's also the matter of an old account that scholars spent ages refusing to believe. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus described, in remarkable detail, a ritual practiced by the Scythians, fierce nomads of the Eurasian steppe. After a burial, he wrote, the men would lean 3 poles together into a kind of teepee, drape it with thick felt, set a dish of red-hot stones inside, and throw cannabis onto the stones. Then they'd crawl in, breathe the smoke, and, in the famous line from Book 4, howl with joy. No Greek steam bath, he added, could surpass it. For centuries, readers assumed he'd either garbled the scene or embroidered it for effect. He even seems to have half mistaken it for a kind of bath. Then, in 1929, the archaeologist Sergei Rudenko began excavating the frozen Scythian burial mounds at Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains, where permafrost had seeped into the chambers and deep froze the contents for 2.5 millennia. And there it was. The leaning poles, a bronze vessel full of stones and charred hemp seeds, the felt covering, exactly what Herodotus described. The man hadn't been spinning a tall tale. He'd been reporting faithfully what stood in front of him. If anything, he undersold the strangeness of it. Tobacco is the plant most people picture the instant smoking comes up. So it deserves its own moment. It belongs to the genus Nicotiana, and it's native to the Americas. And that origin matters enormously, because it means the entire old world, every civilization across Europe, Africa, and Asia, knew nothing of it until ships crossed the Atlantic at the very end of the 15th century. When European sailors reached the Caribbean in 1492, They almost immediately noticed the locals doing something that made no sense to them. Columbus himself recorded men and women carrying small, smoldering bundles, pulling smoke from burning, dried leaves and letting it stream back out through their noses and mouths. His crew were baffled. His crew also, within a remarkably short time, tried it themselves, because of course they did. But tobacco use in the Americas runs vastly deeper than that first meeting. Nicotine residue inside an ancient pipe from Alabama pushes it back about 3,300 years. And that was, until recently, the oldest hard evidence we had. The deeper truth is that across the ancient Americas, tobacco was not mainly recreational. It was sacred. It moved through healing ceremonies, through dealings with the spirit world, through the sealing of agreements between peoples. To blow smoke over someone was to bless them, to bind yourself to them, to show respect. A shaman drawing on tobacco wasn't taking a casual cigarette break. He was opening a channel between the living and the divine, and the smoke itself was understood as a living messenger, carrying prayers upward and drawing visions down. That framing explains a lot. It's why tobacco use stayed so measured, so ritualized, so carefully held in so many indigenous cultures for thousands of years. When a thing is sacred, you treat it with reverence. You don't chain smoke it while waiting for a bus. The idea of tobacco as a casual, everyday companion, something you reach for on a break, is almost entirely a European reinvention, and a fairly recent one at that. Now reach back further to a discovery most people have never heard of, and it may be the oldest evidence of intentional tobacco use anywhere in the record. Out in the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah, on a barren mudflat, where wind has been peeling away the sediment for thousands of years, archaeologist Darren Duke and his team found the remains of an ancient hearth. They call it the wishbone site, after the tiny duck wishbones left in the ashes from long ago meals. And inside that hearth, alongside stone tools and bird bones, sat 4 charred seeds of a wild desert tobacco, Nicotiana attenuata, a species that was never domesticated but is still used by indigenous people in the region today. These weren't seeds that blew in by accident. They were concentrated, placed there. The hearth is about 12,300 years old. That single find dragged the timeline of human tobacco use back by some 9,000 years past the Alabama pipe, into the tail end of the Ice Age, when this desert was cool marshland. The hunter-gatherers who built that fire may have smoked the tobacco, or chewed wads of the fiber for the nicotine kick. We know almost nothing else about them. But the find raises a genuinely electric question. If people were feeding tobacco into fires 12,000 years ago here in North America, what were people on the far side of the world doing with their local mind-altering plants at the very same moment? Because 12,000 years ago, humans were everywhere. Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia. And the hunger to alter the mind, to reach for some shifted state of awareness, is not an American trait. It's a human one. A fourth hunger. Here's an idea that sounds wild, but is taken seriously by serious people. Call it the intoxication hypothesis. The argument runs like this. In nearly every human society ever documented, people have found routes to alter their own consciousness. They've brewed fermented drinks, eaten psychedelic mushrooms, breathed smoke, chewed leaves, swallowed seeds. The behavior shows up so widely, so stubbornly, and so independently from one culture to the next that some researchers conclude it can't just be a quirk of fashion. The psychopharmacologist Ronald Siegel argued in the 1980s that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and sex, and that it's biologically embedded in animal life, not unique to us. The natural world backs him up in some genuinely strange ways. Elephants go out of their way for fermented marula fruit. Reindeer in Siberia have been seen eating intoxicating Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and then drinking the urine of other reindeer who ate them first, because the active compounds pass through intact. reindeer doing drug recycling in the snow. Honestly, respect. The point is this: if the pull toward an altered mind runs that deep through living things, then it's entirely reasonable to suppose that early humans, long before they domesticated a single plant, long before pottery or pipes or any of the tools we file under smoking, were deliberately exposing themselves to the smoke of psychoactive plants, because experience had taught them it changed something inside. Maybe they burned those plants on purpose during rituals. Maybe they chose where to camp partly with certain plants in mind. Maybe they learned the hard way which smoke lifted you and which smoke felt like dying, a distinction that, with some plants, you only get to misjudge once. This was trial and error in its rawest form, run at the highest possible stakes, occasionally fatal in the most literal sense. But the ones who survived remembered. They told the others. They passed it down through generations that never wrote a word, but lived every lesson, which is exactly how nearly all human knowledge traveled, for nearly all of human time. Not libraries, not schools. Lived experience handed mouth to ear, around a fire, in the dark. Smoke as medicine. There's a thread to this that rarely comes up, and it flips the whole thing on its head. Before smoking was a pleasure, before it was a sacrament, it may have been medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in the world, a scroll over 20 meters long, compiled in Egypt around 1550 BC, contains what may be the first written description of an inhaler. The instructions are almost shockingly specific. Fetch 7 stones and heat them in the fire. Place a little of the remedy on a hot stone. Cover it with a vessel whose bottom has been pierced. Fit a reed into the hole. Put your mouth to the reed and inhale the smoke. The remedy involved henbane, a plant that we now know releases tropane alkaloids like atropine, genuinely useful for easing the airways. To a modern reader, it sounds insane. You're treating a struggling pair of lungs by filling them with smoke, but the plant really does carry pharmacological punch, so the logic was less reckless than it first appears. The ancient Greeks did the same. Therapeutic fumigation was routine, and Hippocrates, the man whose name new doctors still swear an oath to, wrote about inhaling herbal vapors to treat diseases of the lungs. The reasoning held together by the standards of the day. Smoke reaches the lungs directly, so if the plant has healing properties, delivering it as smoke makes a certain practical sense. The lungs as a doorway, medicine inhaled. We still lean on that exact principle today. Asthma inhalers, anesthetic gases, the fine mist of a nebulizer. The delivery method survived. The burning, thankfully, mostly didn't. Far to the east, the ancient Indian medical tradition described a practice called dhumapana, literally smoke drinking, laid out in foundational Ayurvedic texts like the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita. It involved inhaling medicinal smoke through a pipe, with named herbs matched to named conditions: coughs, sinus trouble, headaches, and detailed instructions for preparing each one. This was nothing casual or improvised. It was a sophisticated medical system with careful protocols and centuries of refinement behind it. Egypt, Greece, India, Mesopotamia, in essentially every early civilization on record, people can be found breathing smoke on purpose for the sake of their health, treated not as a vice, but as a recognized branch of medicine. Not because they were hooked, not because it looked cool, because it worked, or worked sometimes, or worked often enough that they kept coming back to it. And in a world with no antibiotics, no surgery worth the name, none of the instruments modern medicine takes for granted works sometimes, was a genuinely meaningful bar to clear. The fire that held the group together. There's one more angle that deserves real attention, and it's about how humans bind themselves to one another. We are intensely social animals. We evolved in groups, and for most of our past, the cohesion of a group, its ability to hold together, to trust, to move as one, was nothing less than a matter of life and death. The lone individual died. The group survived. So anything that strengthened the bonds between people carried real evolutionary weight. And shared ritual, including the shared use of psychoactive substances, is one of the most powerful bonding tools our species has ever found. When a circle of people pass through an altered experience together, it forges a sense of connection and mutual trust that's remarkably hard to build any other way. Modern neuroscience has put hard data behind the old intuition. Shared ritual draws minds into rhythm with one another, lifts trust, and deepens the feeling of belonging to a single group in ways that can actually be measured. So when a band of ancient humans sat together in a closed tent, breathing the smoke of burning cannabis and sinking all at once into a shared altered state, that was never just recreation. It was a kind of social technology. It was how you built the deep trust and tight cohesion that let a group walk into danger together and come back out alive. The smoke circle wasn't a party. It was infrastructure. When the sacred became cheap, and here we reach the uncomfortable turn in the road. The shift from sacred smoke to casual product is, historically speaking, an absolute disaster. When tobacco landed in Europe in the 16th century, it spread at a pace that should remind you of something less than welcome. Within decades, it had crossed from exotic curiosity to continental obsession. By the 1600s, it was being shipped around the globe. By the 1700s, snuff, powdered tobacco sniffed up the nose, was the fashion of the aristocracy. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. And by the early 1900s, the machine-made cigarette had arrived to make tobacco cheaper, more convenient, and more relentlessly addictive than anything before it. What had taken the indigenous peoples of the Americas thousands of years to fold into a measured, ceremonial, deeply meaningful practice was, in the hands of European industrialists, flattened into a mass-market consumer product inside of 4 centuries. And then it got darker. Through the 20th century, the tobacco industry spent decades and untold fortunes burying the evidence that cigarettes caused cancer, evidence its own scientists had gathered internally. It aimed advertising at children. It paid doctors to endorse its products. It engineered its blends specifically to drive nicotine into the body faster and clear it out sooner, tuning the whole experience for maximum dependence. Something ancient, ritual, and communal was reverse engineered into a product designed to be as physically ruinous and as financially extractive as it could possibly be made. A shaman and a tobacco executive both worked with the same plant. They had almost nothing else in common. The gap between a shaman in 500 BC laying cannabis on hot stones in a sacred grave, and a corporate officer in 1960 signing off on a campaign to sell cigarettes to teenagers, is one of the wider moral chasms in human history. Both involve smoke. Past that, the two share practically nothing. So, when did it start? When did ancient humans start smoking? The honest answer is that we don't know precisely, and we probably never will. The hard physical evidence carries us back about 12,300 years with real confidence, and likely much further with reasonable speculation. But the behavior underneath it, the hunger to alter consciousness, to share ritual experience, to use inhaled substances as medicine, is almost certainly older than any artifact we've ever pulled from the ground. It may be as old as fire itself. It may be as old as the cognitive leap that made us human in the first place. The ability to link cause to effect. To look at a smoldering plant and think, last time that happened, I felt different. Let me do that again. That's not addiction, that's intelligence. What we can say is that the behavior is extraordinarily old. It predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates every civilization you ever studied in school. By the time the written record opens, in every corner of the world where humans lived, they were already finding ways to put smoke into their bodies. The specific plants changed. The rituals changed. The purposes changed. But the behavior itself was already ancient long before anyone thought to write it down. There's something almost poetic in that. For all the things that separate us from the people who came before, The technology, the medicine, the glowing screens, the truly baffling volume of stuff we pour into our minds every day. A few thin threads run unbroken across 100,000 years of human life. Fire, smoke, breath. The oldest humans sat around their fires and breathed the same smoky air you'd catch at a bonfire tonight. At some point, some of them began to notice what that smoke was doing to them. Then, they began to choose it. Then, they began to pass that choice down to their children and their children's children, and onward to the Scythians howling in their felt tents, and the Egyptian physicians heating their 7 stones, and the shamans reading visions in the rising plume, and the Taino on a Caribbean beach watching baffled strangers try tobacco for the very first time and cough until their eyes watered. So the next time you flip a light switch, or settle in beside a summer fire, or catch a thread of wood smoke drifting on a cold night, you're taking part in something far older than you realize. You're doing what humans have always done. You're breathing.